You know what I do every time before I start talking? I check that the microphone is on. Except for last time. Hi friends, my name is Emily and welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be refilming the Haunting of Hill House review. I have about 30 minutes of myself talking about the book with no audio. The Haunting of Hill House is the 1959 novel by Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson is a female horror novelist who is a big name if you are familiar with the genre. However, I had never read anything by her. So I posted to my patrons two options. We Have Always Lived in the Castle and The Haunting of Hill House, both by Shirley Jackson, and folks in tier 3 who have the power to vote and to shape my TBR, to shape what we see on this channel, voted that I start with The Haunting of Hill House. I first became interested in this book last Halloween when the Netflix adaptation came out. I have seen the Netflix adaptation and it is a very loose adaptation. It's almost like somebody took the set pieces and played dolls with them. So Jackson has provided the names of the characters and the setting of Hill House, a house with a storied past that likes to play with its inhabitants. And Netflix sort of picks up on that and is like, what if we planted a young family with their children in this house? How would that go? Little kids in a haunted house. And that, in its own way, is weird and wacky and wonderful, and I loved it. I knew going into the novel by Jackson, the source material, that I wasn't getting the same story. I knew that they had played with this story. And so in the novel, you have the setting, you have Hill House, this isolated, storied house, and you have some similar characters, but their relationship to one another is completely different. So these four characters come together because Dr. Montague is an occult scholar and he wants to study sort of paranormal phenomena, and so he has heard of this house, Hill House, that's rumored to be haunted, and he wants to go and study it. He invites people to share in this experience with him, and so we have his assistant, Theodora, show up. Theodora is a badass, independent woman who I read as queer. I mean, the Netflix show makes her queer. I knew that in my head, but at the same time going into it, I was like, oh yeah, it's totally fair to read Theo in the text as queer. She's very strong, she's independent, she lives in the city, she owns a business, she's single. I loved Theo. Theo was great. We have Luke, who is the one-day inheritor of Hill House. He has come to the house to sort of just observe what he will be inheriting. Then we have Eleanor, aka Nell, who is a troubled, isolated woman. Her mother is dead, she has a strained relationship with her sister, and she hasn't experienced very much of the world. I believe she tells them that she is 36, but she lies. She's really younger than that. She's 34, but she reads as way younger. I can totally see how you could take somebody like Nell and take their narrative and sort of age them down in the way that the TV series does. Anyways, so it is about these four humans exploring this house. The house weighs heavily on them in the same way that the Overlook Hotel in Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining by Stephen King is physically impossible. The Hill House has been designed in a way to be unsettling and impossible. I personally feel like if anyone were to deliberately build a house like this, it would be condemned, but this house is standing and it, like, nothing's at a right angle, nothing is hung straight. The rooms sort of spiral in their crookedness. It's a physically impossible building that's designed to make you feel off, like unsettled. Everything is crooked, and because you exist in this space, you are naturally also not straight. You are not level. You're not on the level when you're in the house. I think the other thing that I really appreciated about this, and I'm wondering if it's a theme throughout Jackson's works, but also maybe women who write horror. I'll have to see how I feel about this when I get to my little Women of Horror series that I want to do in March 2020. It was supposed to happen this October, didn't happen this October, but it's still on my mind. The guiding question is, do women writing horror do something different? Is their preoccupation different? Is the horror different? And I think in terms of Jackson, the horror at work in Hill House, at least, is the horror of the domestic. Imagine a house of this size to run properly requires staff. For a single woman to take on this role of maintenance, it becomes an all-consuming task. The domestic labor to clean, to care for, to organize a house of this size is all-consuming. To nourish and nurture and preserve this space as a loving and inviting home, it requires the woman to be the stereotypical woman, the stereotypical housewife, homemaker, to be completely consumed by the home and by her work in the home. I've started reading We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, and the sisters there live in a similarly large old house. And so Maricat and Connie, I believe, talk about how every day they do a little bit of cleaning in order to keep up the house. And it's like too much to set aside time to, like, set aside a day on the weekend to clean the house because there's too much house. You have to do a little bit every day. So every day, some part of their day is consumed by domestic labor. And I wonder if the idea that Hill House is this place that seems to consume lives. It's a place where tragedy has happened. It's a place that draws weak people in, speaks to that horror of being a woman of a certain time period who is expected to marry, who doesn't deviate from that plan, who spends her whole life performing this housewife role, not by choice, but by necessity. Like, it's like you become a housewife or you're destitute. You're a spinster old maid governess, right? Like, the options for women of a certain time were limited. And so I wonder if the Hill House itself speaks to the horror of that confining female role. And I'm curious if women who write horror explore the horrors of stereotypical femininity, stereotypical heterosexual womanhood in a similar way. Like, are women who write horror exploring something unique is ultimately the question that I'm seeking to answer as I read women who write horror. And I think in terms of Jackson, that reading, that question would be answered yes. Jackson's horror doesn't feel human, because I think even today, men's lives aren't consumed by domestic labor. If you look at the division of labor, who is the keeper of appointments? Who is the keeper of the family? Who spends more time doing unpaid labor with children? Who spends more time doing unpaid labor on house maintenance? Cleaning, cooking, etc. That role still largely falls to women. It's changing. It's definitely not as unequal as it was back when Jackson was writing, but to a certain degree, it's still true. I've seen it in my own life. I see it in the lives of folks around me and how they talk about what they do in their home lives for their families. So it's interesting. It's interesting that the horror in Jackson, I think, is the domestic. It's the domestic sphere as this consuming space. As I move into 2020, as we move into March, which is International Women's Month, or has International Women's Day in it, and I am treating it as a month of reading women. I would like to read more women who write horror in that month, and I'm curious if that holds true. Because right now with Jackson it does, but Jackson is also older than some of the authors I'm curious about checking out in March 2020. Let me know your thoughts on The Haunting of Hill House in the comments down below. Have you read the novel? Have you seen the Netflix adaptation? What do you think? If you have any Shirley Jackson recommendations for me, I am reading We Have Always Lived in the Castle right now. If you have a recommendation for my third Jackson, leave that in the comments down below. And if you have any recommendations for women who write horror, especially contemporary women who write horror, because I suspect that like I could go back to Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights and read those texts as horror. I could make the argument that these are horror texts for women. You could look at something like Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which has those roots, I think, of horror. You can trace like the Bloody Chamber, Bluebeard fairy tale that runs throughout like oral storytelling. It runs into Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories. I see that sort of Bluebeard Bloody Chamber as a precursor to Jane Eyre with her like relationship with Mr. Rochester, sketchiness there, as a precursor to Rebecca. Like there are so many hints of like domestic horror in classic literature that we wouldn't consider horror, but we could argue very easily. There's a PhD or an MA thesis in there if anyone's lost for what to do, tracing that root of female domestic horror. But I'm specifically interested in current horror by women. So if you have recommendations, it's a really long-winded way of saying that if you have any contemporary women writing horror recommendations, even if it's not classified as like genre horror. Before we go, we have to thank my patrons who make videos like this and long-form projects possible. I am working on a book club with them right now. It is the Red Rum Book Club, which is a patron-exclusive book club where we are reading the first 6 books in Stephen King's bibliography. This month, November 2019, we are reading Salem's Lot by Stephen King. Last month, we read Carrie by Stephen King, and there was a live show, and I had a lot of fun with that. Pulled in some fairy tale stuff, pulled in some Matilda. Love making connections. With Salem's Lot, I'm actually seeing some Haunting of Hill House vibes. I'd like to bring this up in the live show. So if you're at all interested in supporting the channel, in reading horror, in chatting with me about horror in a live show at the end of each month, supporting on Patreon, joining the Red Rum Book Club for as little as $1 a month is a way to do that. Links, if you want to join, are in the description box down below. That is all. That is the second time I have recorded this, and hopefully the last. I'll see you soon. Bye.